We did 450 hours of interviews and demos with 110 companies to get the core data, and then we ran a quantitative survey across the top of that. So it's a rich data set. And what we found is that we thought that the number of intelligent tools or AI providers was going to grow at a certain rate over time, and instead what happened in the last year is AI became ubiquitous. And so in your organization today, there's all sorts of AI already, and it's in Microsoft Office, and it's in Google, and it's in all of the browser-based tools that your employees use every day. It's also in every single piece of HR software at the development end. So you may not have it in every piece of HR software that you've got, but it's coming down the pipe, and every one of the people who supply you this stuff has an AI project, and they're working on embedding machine learning in every possible aspect of the tool. Another way of saying that is that we've gotten smarter. Right? So one of the things that we have known all along is that the narrower the problem, the better the result with this stuff. So what you need to get a really good result is a well-defined problem and a rich data set underneath it, and then you can do really interesting things with it. And what's been happening is the definition has been growing out like this. So I would say there's sort of three developmental things that have happened to providers of this stuff. One is companies that had a single function, they were a chatbot company or they were a recruitment process company of some kind. Some of them have gone deeper, and they've gotten deeper and smarter about the single problem that they were trying to solve. Some of them have gone broader, so they've added major functionality in a sort of a horizontal way. And some of them have fled the marketplace because there is, one of the things we cover in the new report is there's an extraordinary failure rate of this stuff. If you're talking about chatbots, something like 70% of all chatbot implementations get turned off. They get turned off not because the chatbot doesn't work, but the business of managing a chatbot includes all sorts of other implications, like changing the jobs of the people who do the stuff that used to be done by the chatbot, or the budgeting associated with maintenance. And so it becomes a difficult thing to manage because it didn't look like it would be a complicated process when you started. It looked like it would simplify things, and it turns out that getting this stuff in is complicated. And the chatbot producers have gotten smarter about how they do implementation. So while there's a big failure rate now, it's early, and the failure rate will continue to decline over time, and the technology will get better. So the answer is sort of yes. The problems are different, and the understanding of what it takes to actually solve the problem is evolving as well. One of the things that's in the report is our annual watch list, and the annual watch list has a dozen vendors whose AI products represent the edges of what's possible in AI. And the panel today had 4 of those vendors on it, and I chose the vendors for the panel based on the fact that there was no observable connection to what they did. So imagine that there's a matrix, and the vertical axis of the matrix is point solution at the top, suite at the bottom, and the horizontal axis is data management at one end and data monitoring at the other end. The players were Swoop Talent in the data management end, Keen Corp in the data monitoring end, Ultimate Software in the suite end, and Modern Hire in the point solution end. Modern Hire does job simulations, and by job simulations, that means that they give you the experience of what it feels like to do the job, and then assess whether or not you'll be good at the job by having the experience of doing the job. And they've recently integrated with a video interviewing company, so there's this one sort of end-to-end analytical tool that moves people from the interview stage through the job simulation stage and takes data all the way through and learns about what works and what doesn't work. At the bottom of that axis is Ultimate Software. And Ultimate Software is such an interesting story. Many years ago, they were a payroll company. They became a human capital management company, and so they've got a full suite of human capital management capability. And about 3 years ago, it's like they bought an old house and lifted it up off its foundation so they could put in a new foundation. And the underlying foundation is AI from a company that they bought called Kanjoya. And Kanjoya looks at employee sentiment as expressed in regularly scheduled questions that are sent out to the workforce, and they get this very clear picture of what's going on inside of the workplace across all of the human capital management functions. On the horizontal axis, you've got Swoop Talent, and what Swoop Talent is really interesting. There's a joke about machine learning that goes like this. Machine learning is 80% data cleaning and 20% complaining about data cleaning. And what Swoop Talent does is it automates a bunch of the process associated with data cleaning. The biggest problem in data cleaning is getting fields that have different names to match up so they go together so you can do a big transform. And their tool uses machine learning to assess the actual content of those columns of data so it can tell where two things would go together without having to have a pivot on the top. At the far end of that spectrum is Keen. And Keen Corp monitors tension in the organization. And when they say tension, what they mean is the language that people use to talk about work varies over time. And as you examine the flow of digital communications, you can start to see the language change based on what's going on in the organization. And that can tell you where embezzlement is happening or sexual harassment is happening. And so you can use this tool at Keen to monitor the data flow and use the data flow as a trouble indicator. And it suggests a world in which instead of waiting for the victim of sexual harassment to do the reporting, you can spot the propensity for sexual harassment in advance and, like a spill on the shop floor, go and clean it up, right? So it turns things that have been reporting problems into health and safety issues. So those are the four that were on the panel, and each of the players, there was either the CEO or the head data scientist for each of these companies. And what was really interesting about the panel is because I put them together, they started to understand where they might work together because they were so different from each other that they represented gaps in the work. And so the panel itself was astonishing because it ended with these guys who had just done demos now talking about how they could use each other to improve each other. And so it was a really wonderful and powerful panel. There's a movie that I think you can download on YouTube called Those Magnificent Young Men and Their Flying Machines. And it's a comedy from the 70s, I think. And it's the story of the early days of aviation. And what happened in the early days of aviation is there were all these ideas about what might work. There were 800 airplane companies before the Wright brothers flew their plane. And those 800 airplane companies, all but one of them suffered crash after crash after crash after crash, and then the Wright brothers flew. And it was necessary for investors and customers to be part of the ecosystem of all of those 800 companies in order to get the one that flew. And what happened over time was like what happened on the panel that I was talking about. The people who were the mechanics in those innovation laboratories of airplanes talked to each other and learned from each other about what worked and what worked in spite of the fact that they were competing with each other. And we're at that stage now. The interesting thing about aviation is it took 20 years to get from the idea to the first flight. It took another 20 years before there were factories producing horribly expensive planes that would fly one person at a time around. And it took another 20 years before Howard Hughes could invent the airline system, which was, it's the dumbest, simplest idea, but nobody was able to have it, and that is an airplane is a bus. But nobody could see that because the original model was a man flying. And we're on that kind of trajectory where we think we know what we're headed towards now. And it's interesting. We're sort of full of these processes that look like they can be automated. But like in the case of recruiting, much of the recruiting intelligence is being applied to a problem that's got a 50% failure rate. And so because there's heavy emphasis on return on investment that people talk about, the vendors are saying, oh, you can do this faster and cheaper with machine intelligence embedded in the tool. And the question is, do you really want to do something that fails 50% of the time faster and cheaper? And we're hitting those questions really hard. And the only way that you can discover how dumb they sound is by going after them. You hear a lot from critics who aren't really versed in technology evolution over time, that there's something wrong with the vendors, that there's something unethical going on here, or that there's some set of claims that are untrue. But what's really happening is we're learning how to think about this, and in learning how to think about this, you have to try a bunch of things on, and some of them fit and make sense, and some of them don't fit and make sense, and it's part of the early evolution of a brand new technology that we're going through. Technology is invented by human beings and always contains the bias of the inventor. It's not possible for human beings not to have bias, and it's not possible for them to invent things that don't have bias. Now, whether the bias is desirable or not is a separate kind of question. And often when people talk about there being bias in AI, what they really mean is illegal bias of the kind that discriminates against people in protected classes. And that it's confusing because, yeah, that's bias, but the universe of bias is a massive environment. And what we know, there's this great experiment at Amazon. Amazon tried 500 different data models in their recruiting system, trying to get the predisposition of their hiring process to hire males changed. But they always used the historical data, and what they found was that the data is biased, right? And so this technology takes data and turns it into rules. That's what it does. And so whatever the history of the data is going to be reflected in the rules that are output in the thing. And that's just a thing. And so what that really means is that when you get an output from a machine, you can't ever believe that it's the truth. It's the machine's opinion. And as the consumer of that opinion, you have to take that opinion and make a decision. And the one thing that you should never, ever, ever do is let the machine make the decision. Never. When it comes to people and their livelihoods and their access to opportunity, machines don't have compassion or common sense or intuition or any of the things that make really good decisions happen. They just have an input. When you have AI, and this is worth thinking about. When you have AI, it's like you just hired the best historian in the whole world. And this historian has access to everything that happened in the past related to this particular problem. And what this historian is really good at doing is telling you what would happen if nothing changed from the past. But the reality of the world that we live in is it's driven by emergent phenomena. And so it's never the same as what happened in the past. And so it's very useful to know that on the first Sunday of September every year for the last 10 years it rained. It's really useful to know that. And it means on the first Sunday in September, you probably want to take an umbrella. But the machine isn't wrong if it doesn't rain. You have to make the decision about what to do with the thing. And so when it comes to liability, the machine gives you the input, but you're the employer and you have the liability, and no court in the world is ever going to change that. You make the decision, the human makes the decision, and so the machine holds no liability.